I pressed my thumb against the brass clasp of my leather portfolio. It opened with a sharp, heavy click. The sound cut through the dining room like a gavel. My mother, Brenda, stopped chewing. The piece of roasted chicken on her stainless steel fork slipped, hitting her porcelain plate with a high, hollow ring. I stood in the doorway of her Meridian, Idaho farmhouse, wearing a tailored black graduation gown. Draped over my shoulders with a heavy silk sash. The fabric was a deep crimson. Embroidered down the front in gold thread was the word Veritas. My sister Jessica sat across the table, her wine glass suspended halfway to her mouth. She had funded this Sunday roast on a credit card she could not pay, a habit that defined her entire adult life. Neither of them spoke. The air in the room grew thin. I reached into the portfolio and pulled out a single sheet of heavy cream cardstock. The edges were charred black, flaking dry soot onto the tips of my fingers. I stepped forward and laid it precisely in the center of the white lace tablecloth, right next to the gravy boat. I looked down at my mother. Her chest stopped moving. "It took 7 years, 2 degrees, and a federal audit," I said, keeping my voice level, "for me to finally bring you your mail, Mom." Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. This is the channel where we explore the moment the fog lifts, the silent calculations of survival, and the cold reality of handing someone the exact consequence they earned. If you have ever been the designated shock absorber for your family, tell me your age in the comments, and be sure to subscribe. Let me tell you how a girl rejected by every college in America ended up standing on her abusive family's porch, holding an Ivy League diploma and the evidence of a federal crime. It started with the hinges on a rusted mailbox. 7 years earlier, at 18, I spent the month of April walking down our dirt driveway to Route 9. The Idaho dust coated my sneakers every afternoon as I pulled open that metal door, listening to it shriek, waiting for a thick envelope. I'd applied to 12 universities. 5 of them were elite. I spent my high school years studying in the barn loft by the light of a kerosene heater, maintaining a perfect grade point average, while Jessica drove her friends to the mall in the car our parents bought her. But the mailbox stayed empty. Every day, Brenda stood on the porch, wiping her hands on a dish towel, watching me walk back with nothing. She had insisted on managing my applications. She created a specific email account for my submissions, claiming our rural internet was too spotty for me to track it myself. One Tuesday, she met me at the bottom of the porch steps. She held out a generic, single-page application for a junior clerking job at the local agricultural supply warehouse. "They sent digital updates, Evie," Brenda said, her voice dripping in that practiced, saccharine sympathy she used when she wanted to appear maternal. "The rejections came through this morning. All of them. Elite places do not want farm girls from Idaho. You need to know your place, stay close, and pull your weight." She patted my cheek, a physical dismissal of my entire future, and handed me the warehouse application. I took the paper. I folded it, walked to my room, and accepted the life she handed me. I spent the next 3 years trapped in Boise, balancing ledgers for fertilizer shipments, while Jessica racked up debt. I became the reliable foundation they could bleed dry. But Brenda made one critical error the day she told me those rejections were digital. She forgot that fire leaves a physical trace, and paper burns much slower when it is hidden under wet leaves. By the time I turned 21, the trap was fully set, and the demands began to escalate. I had settled into the rigid geometry of a life I never chose. I worked as a junior financial auditor at an agricultural supply firm in downtown Boise. The salary was $48,000 a year. In the broader scope of the American economy, it was a modest starting wage. In the Hamilton household, it made me an unmined gold reserve. I still lived in my childhood bedroom. The rent I paid my parents was steep, not just in dollars, but in the daily tax of proximity. I became the designated shock absorber for every poor decision made under that roof. It was a Tuesday in early October. The kitchen was cold, holding the overnight chill of the Idaho autumn. I stood by the counter pouring cheap drip coffee into a travel mug, dressed in a pressed gray blazer and slacks. I had to leave in 12 minutes to beat the morning traffic on Interstate 84. Then came the sound. Thud. Scrape. Thud. My father, Richard, wore steel-toed leather work boots from the moment he woke up until the moment he went to sleep. His footsteps on the peeling yellow linoleum of the kitchen floor were a physical manifestation of his entitlement. He walked like a man who owned the earth beneath him, regardless of whose name was actually on the deed. He stepped into the fluorescent light of the kitchen and tossed a stapled packet of papers onto the Formica island. It slid, stopping inches from my travel mug. "Look that over and sign the bottom line before you head out," he said. He did not say good morning. He did not pour himself a cup of coffee. He simply issued a directive. I set the glass pot back on the heating pad. I picked up the packet. It was a commercial equipment loan application from a regional bank. The principal amount was $15,000. The item listed was a used John Deere 5075E utility tractor. Below the vehicle specifications was a blank line for a primary applicant, which Richard had already signed in his sharp, jagged handwriting. Below that was a line for a secondary guarantor. My printed name was typed underneath it. "You want me to co-sign a loan?" I asked, keeping my eyes on the interest rate printed in the fine text. It was 12%, predatory even for agricultural equipment. "The farm is going through a tight season," Evie Richard said, leaning against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "We need the deer to clear the south acreage before the ground freezes. My credit took a hit last winter when the irrigation system failed. The bank just needs a second signature from someone with a steady W-2. It is just a formality." "I am a financial auditor, Dad," I said, setting the packet back down on the island. "I know exactly what a guarantor form is. It is not a formality. It means when the farm fails to make the monthly payments, the bank will garnish my wages and destroy my credit score." His jaw tightened. The casual authority vanished, replaced by the familiar, rigid indignation he used whenever someone challenged his narrative. "The farm is not failing. We are just experiencing a cash flow bottleneck. Family steps up during bottlenecks." "I stepped up when I paid the property tax in March," I said. "I stepped up when I covered the veterinary bills for the livestock in July. I cannot leverage my own financial future for a tractor with a 12% interest rate. The math does not work." I picked up my travel mug. Richard stepped into my path, blocking the hallway. He was a tall man, broadened by decades of physical labor, but the intimidation tactic felt hollow. "After everything this roof has provided you," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "we raised you, we fed you, we kept you safe. Now you have a fancy desk job in the city, and you turn your back on the soil that paid for your clothes. I paid for these clothes, Dad. I bought them in a discount rack so I could look professional at the job that keeps our electricity turned on. I am not signing the paper." I stepped around him. He did not grab my arm, but the silence that followed me out the door was heavier than a shout. That refusal triggered a week of orchestrated psychological warfare. The tactics were never overt. They were designed to maintain plausible deniability while making my existence as miserable as possible. The next morning, the hot water valve in the downstairs bathroom was twisted shut halfway through my shower, leaving me shivering under a stream of ice. When I brought it up, Brenda claimed the old pipes were just acting up. 2 days later, the lunch I had meal prepped for the week vanished from the refrigerator. Richard said he thought it was leftovers and fed it to the farm dogs. When I sat in the living room trying to review audit files on my laptop, Brenda would walk in, sigh heavily, turn up the television volume to an intolerable level, and begin aggressively dusting the coffee table right next to my screen. They wanted me exhausted. They wanted me hungry. They wanted me to realize that peace in that house cost exactly $15,000. I did not break. I bought a sandwich at the deli near my office. I took cold showers. I worked late to avoid the living room. But the pressure forced me to look backward. Driving my cheap commuter car down the dark stretch of highway each evening, I thought about how I had ended up in this cage. 3 years earlier, I had been a straight-A student with a pristine transcript. I had dreamed of leaving Idaho behind. I had spent hours researching financial aid programs, writing application essays in the quiet of the barn, and dreaming of the brick architecture of the East Coast. But Brenda had intercepted the logistics of that dream. She had insisted on setting up a specific email account for my college applications. She told me the rural broadband was too unreliable, and she needed to monitor the incoming messages on her desktop computer during the day while I was at school. She promised to keep a meticulous spreadsheet of every response. I trusted her, because you are supposed to trust your mother when she offers to shoulder a burden. Then came the day she handed me the feed store application. She told me the Ivy Leagues had sent digital rejections, every single one of them. She looked me in the eye with a sorrowful expression and told me the world outside Meridian did not want me. I had internalized that rejection. I let it calcify into a belief that my ambition had been arrogant. I abandoned my dreams, enrolled in a local community college to get a basic accounting certificate, and went to work. But sitting in traffic, watching the taillights bleed red across the damp asphalt, a cold, sharp discrepancy began to gnaw at the back of my mind. It was a detail I had overlooked in the fog of my teenage grief. The morning Brenda handed me the feed store application and told me my academic life was over, I had gone to her desktop computer. I had wanted to read the rejection emails myself. I wanted to see the words from the admissions offices, to hurt myself with the reality of my failure. When I clicked on the browser, the email portal was logged out. I typed in the password Brenda had given me weeks earlier. The screen flashed red. Password incorrect. At the time, I assumed it was a glitch. I was too devastated to press the issue. I walked away and never tried to log in again. But now, with 3 years of auditing experience rewiring my brain, I understood that numbers and systems do not lie. People do. If I had genuinely been rejected by every college in America, if the truth was exactly what my mother claimed it was, why did she change the password to that email account the very next day? Once you stop looking at your family through the lens of obligation and start viewing them as an audit subject, the behavioral anomalies become impossible to ignore. The changed email password was the initial thread. I began to pull it quietly, observing the daily routines of the Meridian farmhouse with a sterile, clinical detachment. I did not ask questions. I simply watched the patterns. The most glaring deviation from normal behavior centered on a rusted metal box perched on a rotting wooden post at the end of our dirt driveway. Route 9 carried heavy semi-truck traffic, kicking up clouds of dry earth that coated the mailbox in a permanent layer of gray film. For as long as I could remember, Brenda treated that rusted cylinder like a classified military vault. On a Wednesday afternoon, I managed to finish my ledger reviews early and drove home while the sun was still high. I parked my sedan near the barn and walked down the driveway to stretch my legs. The mail carrier had just driven past, leaving the metal flag raised. I reached out and pulled the squeaking door open, grasping a stack of envelopes. Before I could even flip through the top catalogs, the screen door of the farmhouse banged against its frame. Brenda marched down the wooden steps, moving with a frantic, rigid energy. Her gardening shoes crunched against the gravel. "Give that to me, Evie," she said, holding her hand out, palm up. Her breathing was shallow. "It is just the utility bill and some grocery circulars," I replied, keeping my voice mild. "I handle the paperwork for this house," Brenda snapped. She snatched the stack from my fingers. Her knuckles were white, gripping the paper tight enough to crease the envelopes. "You have your corporate job. Leave the domestic management to me." She turned her back and hurried inside, locking the screen door behind her. A mother protecting her household from chores is a common narrative. A mother experiencing a physiological stress response because her 21-year-old daughter touched the Daily Post is a red flag. She was hoarding the inflow of information, holding a monopoly on whatever arrived with postage. The financial discrepancies became apparent the very next evening. Thursday dinners were a mandatory attendance event. Richard sat at the head of the table claiming poverty while serving cheap meatloaf and instant potatoes. The conversation inevitably circled back to the $15,000 loan I had refused to sign. He laid the guilt thick, talking about the coming frost and the mechanical failures of his aging equipment. Then Tyler walked into the dining room. Tyler had married my sister Jessica right out of high school. He listed his occupation as regional sales, but his actual vocation was avoiding manual labor. He pulled out a chair and sat down, smelling of expensive cologne and diesel exhaust. Tyler had just purchased a brand new 3/4-ton pickup truck. The vehicle sat parked right outside the kitchen window. It featured a lifted suspension, custom chrome rims, and a leather interior. It was a $60,000 piece of machinery. He leaned back in his wooden dining chair, spinning his key fob around his index finger. The heavy metal ring clinked against his tungsten wedding band in a rhythmic, steady beat. The sound echoed over my father complaining about cash flow bottlenecks. "You just have to know how to move the numbers around," Tyler said, offering a smug, asymmetric smile. He caught the key fob in his palm. "I got the dealership to run the financing through a shell company I set up online. Creative accounting keeps the IRS off your back and puts you behind the wheel." Brenda smiled, passing him the bowl of potatoes. Richard offered a low, approving chuckle. I sat quiet, slicing my food. I was an auditor. I spent 40 hours a week tracking missing assets and identifying fraudulent ledgers. I ran the mental math. Richard claimed his credit was too ruined to secure a modest loan for a used farm tractor, demanding my signature to save their livelihood. Yet he sat there, praising his son-in-law for manipulating the financial system to buy a luxury truck they did not need. The narrative they presented to me was a calculated fiction. The farm was not broke. They simply preferred spending my money over their own. The reality of their coordination crystallized the following morning. Friday marked the end of the financial quarter. It was the most critical day of the month at my firm. I had to be at my desk by 6:30 to begin processing the corporate tax reconciliations. Missing a quarter-end shift was grounds for immediate disciplinary action. I woke up at 5. I dressed in the dark, packed my briefcase, and walked into the kitchen. I reached for the brass hook mounted on the wall beside the mudroom door where I always hung my car keys. The hook was empty. I checked my coat pockets. I searched the floor. I walked to the living room and checked the cushions. A cold, sharp wave of adrenaline washed over my chest. I opened the side door and looked out into the driveway. My modest gray sedan was gone. Tyler sat at the kitchen island drinking black coffee from a ceramic mug. He watched me retrace my steps, holding the warm cup with both hands. "Looking for your ride?" he asked, his tone casual. "Where is my car, Tyler?" "Jessica took it," he replied, taking a slow sip. Her SUV was low on premium gas, and she did not want to stop at the station on her way to the outlet mall in Meridian. There's a big shoe sale starting at 6. She figured you would not mind. I stared at him. She took my vehicle, without asking, on the most important workday of my quarter, to buy shoes. "I have a mandatory audit shift, Tyler. I need to be in Boise in 40 minutes. I need you to drive me." He set his mug down and stretched his arms over his head. "Cannot do it, Evie. I have a very important sales meeting. Need to prep my materials." He was wearing sweatpants and a stained undershirt. There was no meeting. He was simply enjoying the power of denying me. I walked back to my bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress and called my supervisor. I had to swallow my pride and ask for a half day of unpaid emergency leave, citing a family transport issue. My supervisor noted the absence with a rigid tone, warning me about the impact on my annual performance review. When I hung up the phone, the final piece of the puzzle snapped into place. This was not Jessica being careless. This was not Tyler being lazy. This was a tactical strike. Richard demanding the loan was an attempt to shackle my credit. Brenda guarding the mailbox was an information blackout. Jessica stranding me on a crucial workday was an attack on my professional reputation. They were not a dysfunctional family. They were a unified mechanism. They recognized that my job was my only path to independence. If I continued to build my savings and advance my career, I would eventually move out. To prevent that, they needed to keep me exhausted, broke, and professionally compromised. If I lost my job, I would lose my ability to escape. I would be permanently trapped in that house, managing their debt forever. The air in my bedroom felt thick. I needed to move to occupy my hands before the anger compromised my logic. I changed out of my corporate slacks and put on a pair of old denim jeans. I walked out the back door and headed toward the barn. Sitting against the weathered red wood of the barn was a large, rusted metal burn barrel. It was overflowing with broken cardboard boxes, junk mail, and household waste. Burning the trash was Tyler's designated weekly chore. Naturally, he had neglected it for nearly a month. The refuse was spilling over the jagged metal rim. Seeking a mindless physical task to burn off the nervous energy, I walked over to the workbench and grabbed a long box of wooden matches. I approached the rusted container, intending to reduce their accumulated waste to ash. I reached into the barrel to push the top layer of cardboard down. I did not know that the bottom of that metal drum held the ghost of my 18-year-old self, waiting patiently in the dark. The air behind the barn was stagnant, carrying the heavy scent of damp earth and decomposing alfalfa. I stood before the rusted 55-gallon drum. The metal siding was corrugated and flaking oxidized orange paint peeling away in brittle sheets. Rainwater from a recent storm had collected at the base, creating a dense, soggy mass of ruined paper and yard debris. I grabbed the top edges of a broken Amazon box, trying to force it deeper into the barrel to create room for the dry trash resting on top. The damp cardboard gave way under my weight. My hand slipped, plunging downward. My wrist grazed the inner wall of the drum. A jagged shard of rusted steel, curving inward like a dull tooth, caught the sleeve of my wool sweater. The metal tore through the thick-knit fabric and sliced a sharp, clean line across the fleshy heel of my right palm. I pulled my hand back with a sharp inhale. A line of bright red blood welled to the surface of my skin, stinging against the cool autumn air. The sudden physical pain forced me to stop. I gripped my wrist, pressing my thumb against the cut to stem the bleeding. I leaned over the rim of the barrel to inspect the metal edge that had caught me. The sunlight hit the bottom of the drum, illuminating the wet, decaying layers of Tyler's neglected chore. My breathing stopped. Stuck to the curved bottom wall of the barrel, held in place by a plaster of rotting oak leaves, was a thick, rectangular envelope. The paper was heavy cream-colored cardstock. It did not look like the glossy junk mail or the thin windowed envelopes of utility bills Brenda usually discarded. It possessed an undeniable weight, even while waterlogged. The right half of the envelope was charred black, the edges curling inward where a fire had attempted to consume it before being extinguished by the rain. The left half was untouched. I reached my uninjured left hand down into the barrel. My fingertips brushed the cold, slick surface of the wet leaves. I pinched the edge of the cream paper and pulled. It peeled away from the rusted metal with a soft, tearing sound. I held it up to the light. The thick paper was saturated, dripping murky water onto the dirt. A large circular wax seal at the top left corner had melted and warped from the heat, flattening out into a dull red smear. But the printing was legible. Stamped in crisp, formal black ink just below the ruined seal was a crest, a shield enclosing 3 open books. Across the books, a single word was inscribed in Latin: Veritas. Below the crest, typed in precise serif font, was my name, Evelyn Hamilton. Beside my name was a date stamped 3 years prior, the spring of 2018. I stood there in the shadow of the barn, holding a piece of paper that defied the physics of my reality. 3 years ago, Brenda had looked me in the eye and handed me a warehouse application. She had told me, with a face full of manufactured maternal pity, that every elite institution had rejected me digitally. She had claimed the world outside Meridian had no place for me. Yet here in my hand was the physical proof that the most prestigious university in America had mailed an acceptance package to my rural Idaho address. An acceptance package my mother had intercepted from the mailbox at the end of Route 9. She had hidden it. She had carried it behind the barn, thrown it into the trash, and struck a match. The fire had not burned long enough. The rain had drowned the flames before they could erase her crime. The cut on my palm throbbed a steady, rhythmic pulse that synchronized with the pounding in my temples. The emotional shock did not register as sadness. It registered as a profound, terrifying vertigo. The narrative of my life. The belief that I was a failure, destined to balance local ledgers while my sister drove my car and my father demanded my credit score, was a complete and total fabrication. I was not a prisoner of circumstance. I was a prisoner of a coordinated domestic conspiracy. Brenda had changed the password to the college email account, not because the portals were empty, but because she needed to delete the digital congratulations before I could see it. She had burned the physical letter to destroy the paper trail. She had engineered my despair solely to ensure I remained her financial utility mule. My first instinct, the raw human impulse, was to march back to the farmhouse. I wanted to kick the kitchen door open. I wanted to slap the wet, charred envelope onto the Formica Island right in front of Tyler and his black coffee. I wanted to scream at Brenda until my vocal cords shredded. I wanted to watch her face collapse when she realized her flawless lie had survived the fire. I took one step toward the house. The gravel crunched under my boot. Then the logic centers of an auditor's brain kicked in, overriding the adrenaline. If I confronted them now, what exactly would happen? I was standing on their property. I slept in a room they owned. My car was currently stolen by Jessica. My bank account held a meager $5,000, which Brenda could likely access through the joint checking agreement she forced me to sign when I was 16. Confrontation is a luxury reserved for those who hold the leverage. If I showed them the letter, I would surrender the only advantage I possessed, the element of surprise. If Brenda realized I knew the truth, she would not apologize. She would panic. A panicked abuser is a dangerous entity. She would double down. She would freeze my accounts, hide my birth certificate, report my car stolen, or invent a crisis to keep me tethered. She would build a thicker cage before I could run. I stopped walking. I looked down at the burnt cream cardstock in my hand. I did not scream. I did not cry. I let the cold, surgical anger wash over me, freezing the panic into a hard, unbreakable resolve. I carefully folded the wet envelope in half, keeping the crest intact. I slid it into the front pocket of my denim jeans. I turned back to the burn barrel, struck a wooden match, and dropped it onto the dry cardboard near the top. The flames caught quickly, sending a plume of gray smoke into the Idaho sky. I walked back to the farmhouse. My hand was bleeding. My clothes smelled of smoke. My mind was executing a complex threat assessment. I entered the kitchen through the mudroom. Tyler was gone. Brenda stood at the sink scrubbing a frying pan. She glanced over her shoulder, noting the dirt on my jeans and the blood on my hand. "Cut myself on the barrel," I said, my voice flat, devoid of any emotional inflection. "Taking care of Tyler's chore. Wash it out and use the iodine under the sink," she replied, turning back to her dishes. Her voice carried the same casual dismissal she had used for 21 years. I walked to the bathroom. I held my hand under the cold faucet, watching the red blood swirl down the white porcelain drain. I looked at my reflection in the mirror above the sink. My eyes were dark, steady, and entirely changed. I was no longer the obedient daughter of Meridian. I was an undercover operative living behind enemy lines. I needed to execute a ghost protocol. I had to smile at the dinner table. I had to feign compliance. I had to let them believe they were winning while I meticulously planned my extraction. The Ivy League had wanted me 3 years ago. The question was whether they would still want me now. I had to find a way to contact the admissions office of a university located 2,000 miles away without leaving a single digital footprint on the family network. I needed a machine they could not trace and a network they could not monitor. I dried my hand. I reached into my pocket and touched the damp, folded edge of the charred envelope. I knew exactly what my first move had to be. I locked my bedroom door, pressing the small brass button into the handle. It was a flimsy mechanism, easily bypassed with a hairpin, but it provided a necessary 3-second warning against sudden intrusions. I walked to my desk and laid down a clean, dry hand towel. Carefully, I extracted the wet, heavy cardstock from my denim pocket and placed it flat on the cotton fabric. I studied the charred edges under the glow of my desk lamp. Fire is traditionally the ultimate destroyer of evidence. It consumes and erases, leaving nothing but dust. Yet, in a profound stroke of scientific irony, the flames in Tyler's burn barrel had acted as a chemical preservative. The heat had carbonized the right quadrant of the thick paper, transforming the edge into a dense shield of soot. That black barrier had repelled the Idaho rainwater, preventing the moisture from soaking through and washing away the crisp, black ink of the Harvard crest. The fire meant to destroy my future had inadvertently saved it. I pulled my smartphone from my blazer pocket. I turned off the flash and silenced the shutter volume. I took 20 distinct photographs of the document, capturing every angle, the melted wax seal, the date, the signature of the admissions dean, and my own printed name. I uploaded the images directly to a secure, encrypted cloud server I maintained for corporate audit files, a vault protected by dual-factor authentication and biometric locks. Once the digital preservation was confirmed, I slid the physical envelope into a clear plastic document sleeve. The rigid polymer casing snapped shut, sealing the damp paper inside. I opened my closet, reached to the very back, and slipped the plastic folder deep inside the torn silk lining of an old winter coat. I sat on the edge of my mattress. The initial surge of adrenaline receded, leaving behind a cold, sterile clarity. My bedroom, the floral wallpaper, the framed high school track ribbons, the wooden dresser, all of it morphed from a sanctuary into a holding cell. I began to map the exact perimeter of my captivity. The raw human impulse urged me to pack a duffel bag, grab my keys, and drive west until the gasoline ran out. But an auditor knows that rash movements trigger immediate financial consequences. If I vanished tonight, Brenda would notice my absence before sunrise. Her first countermeasure would be a phone call to the regional credit union. She would invoke the joint checking agreement she forced me to sign at 16, claiming a maternal emergency to drain my savings. Richard would contact the local sheriff. He would report my gray sedan stolen, citing a fabricated dispute over the vehicle title, which he purposely kept stored in his locked filing cabinet. Jessica would weaponize her social media networks, broadcasting a hysterical narrative about my mental instability, poisoning my professional reputation across the tight-knit Boise business community. I would be stranded, penniless, and unemployable within 48 hours. My entire adult life was a domestic hostage situation. Surviving a hostage scenario requires immense discipline. You do not announce your departure. You do not show your hand. You systematically dismantle the locks from the inside while maintaining unblinking eye contact with your captors. I changed into a fresh sweater, ensuring the sleeves pulled down far enough to cover the iodine-stained bandage on my right palm. I walked down the hall and entered the dining room for Thursday evening supper. The room smelled of overcooked pot roast, boiled carrots, and the sharp metallic tang of Tyler's cheap cologne. I took my usual assigned seat near the kitchen swinging door, the strategic position designated for the person expected to fetch water pitchers and clear dirty porcelain. I unfolded my paper napkin and placed it on my lap. Richard and Tyler were already deep into a loud conversation about hunting gear. Jessica was scrolling through a fashion catalog on her phone, ignoring the food on her plate. Brenda stood at the head of the table, carving the roast with a serrated electric knife. I picked up my fork. As I brought a piece of roasted carrot to my mouth, the faint, acrid scent of wet ash wafted from my bandaged hand. The smell was invisible to the room, but deafening to my senses. It was a secret anchor. It tethered me to the concrete reality of my elite acceptance, while everyone else at the table wallowed in the fiction of my mediocrity. Brenda set the carving knife down and took her seat. She looked across the table, her eyes scanning my face with that practiced, saccharine scrutiny. "You look pale, Evie," she noted, her tone laced with a fabricated maternal worry. "Did the numbers wear you out today? You should rest your mind this weekend. We have a heavy load of weeding to do in the South Garden, and I need your strong back." I looked directly at her. For 2 decades, I had viewed the woman across the table as a stern, hard-working matriarch, trying to hold a rural household together through harsh winters and tight budgets. The illusion shattered, leaving only the raw, jagged truth. I was looking at a warden. A warden who had intercepted my ticket to freedom, threw it into a fire, and smiled at me the next morning while handing me a warehouse application. She burned my Ivy League future because she required a maid and an uncomplaining revenue stream. I did not glare. I did not clench my jaw. I executed a flawless pantomime of the obedient daughter. I offered a flat, tired smile. "Just a long quarter close, Mom," I replied, my voice devoid of any sharp edges. "I will be ready for the yard work on Saturday." Her shoulders relaxed, the tension in her neck uncoiled. She believed the performance. She thought she was the undisputed architect of my reality looking at a compliant subordinate. She had no idea she was sitting across from a demolition expert analyzing the structural weaknesses of her foundation. Behind my steady gaze, the Idaho farm girl she raised was dead, replaced by a silent tactician orchestrating a ghost extraction. The psychological tightrope was established. I could play this role for weeks or months if necessary. I could fetch the water pitchers, endure Tyler's smug lectures, and tolerate Richard's financial demands without breaking character. But the logistical mountain looming ahead was staggering. The charred letter hidden in my closet was dated 3 years ago. Elite universities do not hold vacant seats indefinitely for candidates who never respond. I had missed enrollment deadlines, ignored orientation protocols, and vanished from their registry. Resurrecting a deceased academic profile required initiating contact with an admissions dean located 2,000 miles away. I needed to explain a 3-year silence without sounding like a lunatic. More importantly, I had to accomplish this communication within a sterile, digital environment. I could not use the farmhouse internet router where Tyler monitored the browsing history to track data limits. I could not utilize my corporate desktop where the IT department flagged non-financial outbound web traffic. I possessed no secure hardware. I possessed no untraceable connection. How does a captive living in an agricultural surveillance state secretly acquire the technology to resurrect her Ivy League identity without her warden noticing the purchase? I procured the hardware using a methodical approach to avoid triggering any digital alarms. I could not simply order a computer online and risk a cardboard box arriving on the Meridian porch. I also could not swipe my debit card at an electronics retailer because Brenda scrutinized my monthly bank statements under the guise of helping me build a budget. I began making small cash withdrawals at grocery store registers during my lunch breaks in Boise. $20 here, $40 there. I accumulated the funds over a span of 9 days, keeping the folded bills hidden inside the lining of my leather briefcase. Once the cash reserve reached $300, I drove to a generic big-box retail store on the outer edge of the city limits. I walked past the high-end electronics and found the budget section. I selected a basic black plastic laptop priced at $249. It possessed minimal processing power and a cheap screen, but it held the only feature I required, which was an internet browser. I also purchased a prepaid cellular hotspot device, paying for both items with untraceable paper currency. I declined the receipt. Smuggling the machine into the farmhouse demanded structural camouflage. That evening, I stopped at a local thrift store and bought an outdated hardcover textbook titled Principles of Corporate Taxation. It was 4 inches thick and weighed nearly 5 pounds. When I returned to my bedroom and locked the door, I took a sharp razor blade from my desk drawer. I spent 2 hours carving a rectangular cavity through the center pages of the dense legal volume. I placed the thin black laptop and the hotspot inside the hollowed-out paper chamber. I closed the heavy cardboard cover. It looked identical to the dozens of other reference books stacked on my shelf. The surveillance blind spot was secure. My clandestine academic campaign commenced strictly after midnight. I waited until the floorboards of the old house settled and the rhythmic snoring of Tyler echoed from the guest room down the hall. I would slide out of bed, pull the thick textbook from the shelf, and open my hidden terminal. I worked under the heavy quilt of my bed, pulling the fabric over my head to conceal the faint blue glow of the cheap monitor. The keyboard was made of rigid plastic. Every keystroke produced a tiny mechanical snap. I had to type with agonizing slowness, pressing each key with the soft pad of my index finger to muffle the sound. Those soft, muted clicks beneath the blankets became the soundtrack of my rebellion. I drafted a meticulous email to the admissions dean at the university. I did not write a hysterical plea. I composed a sterile, factual narrative outlining the interception of my physical mail and the unauthorized alteration of my digital portals. I attached the high-resolution photographs of the burnt cream envelope, focusing on the melted wax seal and the legible date. I submitted a formal request to reactivate my application status under a transfer protocol. The sleep deprivation began to compound. I operated on 3 hours of rest each night, drinking bitter black coffee during my morning commutes to maintain my corporate facade. I played my role flawlessly, fetching water pitchers and enduring Richard complaining about the cost of diesel fuel. Brenda, however, sensed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Abusers possess a predatory intuition. When their targets quietly disengage emotionally, they feel the slack in the tether. Brenda decided to reinforce her grip. It happened on a quiet Saturday morning. I walked into the dining room wearing an oversized sweatshirt, intending to pour a glass of water. Brenda was seated at the table. Sitting beside her was a woman I did not recognize, wearing a beige pantsuit and carrying a brass ink stamp. "Evie, sit down for a moment," Brenda said, tapping the wooden surface of the table. I took a seat. Brenda slid a thick stack of legal documents toward me. The pages were bound by a blue cardboard backing. "This is Susan from the county clerk office," Brenda explained, offering a warm, practiced smile that did not reach the corners of her eyes. "Your father and I are doing some estate planning. We are restructuring the farm into a family limited liability company. It is just for tax purposes. It protects our assets. We need you to sign on as a co-trustee." I looked down at the top page. It was an operating agreement for the newly formed entity. "Why do you need my signature?" I asked, keeping my posture relaxed. Susan, the notary, adjusted her glasses. "It is standard procedure for family trusts, dear. It just means you have a vested interest in the property." I pulled the packet closer and began to read the fine print. I was an auditor. My daily vocation involved dissecting corporate structures to find hidden liabilities. I scanned past the boilerplate introductory clauses and found the indemnification section. The legal jargon was dense, but the translation was clear. This document did not merely grant me a vested interest. It assigned me joint and several liability. It meant that any debt incurred by the farm, any unpaid vendor invoice, any defaulted equipment loan would become my personal legal obligation. It was a financial bear trap. If the farm declared bankruptcy, the creditors could legally liquidate my personal savings, garnish my corporate wages, and seize any future assets I acquired. Brenda was attempting to chain me to the sinking ship of Richard and Tyler racking up debt. If I signed, my financial independence would be permanently tethered to their reckless spending. I looked up. Brenda was watching me closely. Her hands were folded, resting on the lace tablecloth. The air in the room was thick with unspoken ultimatums. If I refused to sign, the psychological warfare would escalate into open hostility. They would know I was guarding my assets. They would increase their surveillance. They might demand access to my bank accounts directly or kick me out before my extraction plan was finalized. I needed time. I looked back down at the document. A secondary clause caught my eye: fiduciary access. As a legal co-trustee, I would be granted unrestricted administrative rights to the entity bank accounts, tax returns, and internal ledgers. I would possess the legal authority to view every single financial transaction moving in and out of the farm operations. Brenda thought she was handing me a pair of handcuffs. She did not realize she was handing me the master keys to the prison. I picked up the black ballpoint pen resting beside the paperwork. I did not hesitate. I signed my name on the bottom line. I initialed the secondary pages. Susan applied her brass stamp, pressing the seal into the paper with a heavy thud. "Thank you, Evie," Brenda said, her voice dripping with relief and triumph. "You are a good daughter. Family stays together." I stood up and pushed the chair back. "Yes, Mom," I said, walking toward the kitchen. "Family stays together." I spent the next 2 weeks operating inside the belly of the beast. I worked my auditing job by day, endured the family dinners by evening, and retreated to my hollowed-out textbook by night. The waiting was a slow, grinding friction. Then, on a Tuesday night at 2 a.m, the cheap burner screen illuminated the darkness under my quilt. An email notification appeared in the inbox. The sender address belonged to the admissions office of the university. I clicked the subject line. The text loaded slowly on the weak cellular connection. The message was brief, formal, and staggering. The dean had reviewed the photographic evidence and verified the original acceptance codes. They were appalled by the domestic interception. My application had been successfully reinstated. I was granted full admission for the upcoming fall semester, accompanied by a comprehensive financial aid package designed for independent students. I closed the laptop and lay in the dark, listening to the wind rattle the old window panes of the Idaho farmhouse. I was in. The ghost protocol had worked. But a new terrifying logistical puzzle instantly replaced the triumph. The campus was located in Boston, Massachusetts. I owned 2 suitcases, a sedan that Jessica treated as her personal property, and a savings account Brenda monitored. The upcoming semester started in exactly 6 weeks. How does a captive pack her belongings, purchase a cross-country airline ticket, and walk out the front door without triggering a full-scale domestic war? The digital acceptance letter sat in the encrypted inbox of my hidden laptop, securing my future on the East Coast. The financial aid package was comprehensive, covering tuition, housing, and a modest living stipend. The institution had extended a lifeline. Now I had to engineer my own physical extraction from the farmhouse without triggering a domestic lockdown. If I announced my resignation from the Boise auditing firm and declared my intention to move across the country for academic pursuits, Brenda would immediately recognize the threat. She would understand that I was escaping her jurisdiction. She would mobilize Richard to block my logistics. She would demand access to my savings. She would fabricate a family emergency to chain me to the property. I needed an alibi that pacified her ego. I had to frame my departure not as a triumphant escape, but as a humiliating defeat. Abusers do not stop victims who are walking toward their own perceived misery. They hold the door open and watch them stumble. I waited for Sunday dinner to deploy the narrative. The dining room was warm, radiating heat from the oven. Richard sat at the head of the table, slicing a tough cut of roast beef. Jessica and Tyler were arguing over the cost of premium dog food for a golden retriever they had recently purchased on credit. Brenda stood near the kitchen swinging door, pouring iced tea. I cleared my throat. The sound was quiet, but firm enough to pause the ambient noise. I received a notice from the Corporate Human Resources Department on Friday. I said, staring down at my water glass. The firm is restructuring the regional offices. They are downsizing the Boise auditing division. Richard stopped slicing the meat. The knife rested against the porcelain serving platter. Downsizing, he repeated. Are you losing your paycheck, Evie? We have the winter property taxes due in 3 months. I am not laid off, I replied, keeping my posture slumped, mimicking the body language of a defeated employee. But they eliminated my junior auditor role. The only alternative they offered was a lateral transfer to a subsidiary branch back east, in Massachusetts. Brenda set the glass pitcher down on the wooden sideboard. The ice cubes clinked against the rim. Massachusetts, she echoed, her voice dropping into a skeptical, rigid register. Doing what exactly? Data entry, I said, letting a heavy artificial sigh escape my lungs. It is a windowless processing center on the outskirts of Boston, logging vendor receipts and matching routing numbers. It is a dead-end cubicle gig, but it keeps my health insurance active. Jessica let out a sharp, abrasive laugh. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. From financial auditor to keyboard drone, she sneered. I guess that fancy accounting certificate from the community college only gets you so far. Have fun typing numbers in the freezing cold. I looked at my sister. She was mocking a woman who had just secured a full ride to the oldest and most prestigious university in the Western Hemisphere. The dramatic irony was a sweet, quiet nectar. I swallowed it and nodded, acting properly chastised. It is just a paycheck, I muttered. Richard resumed slicing the beef, his anxiety assuaged by the continuity of my income. When do you leave, he asked. 3 weeks, I answered. Brenda did not return to her seat. She remained standing by the sideboard, her eyes narrowing. The narrative was plausible. Corporate consolidations happened every day. But Brenda possessed a paranoid intuition regarding my autonomy. She needed concrete proof of my vulnerability before she would authorize my physical relocation. She needed to know I lacked the resources to build a successful independent life. I anticipated this skepticism. I had prepared a countermeasure. The following afternoon during my lunch hour in Boise, I drove to a local pharmacy chain. I used a public printing kiosk near the greeting card aisle. I logged into a sterile document editing program and created a fraudulent replica of my regional credit union bank statement. I meticulously matched the fonts, the banking logos, and the transaction formatting. I populated the ledger with mundane, believable expenses: gas station charges, grocery runs, a fabricated invoice for emergency car repairs. Then I adjusted the final line item, the total available checking balance. I typed the number $412. It was a pathetic sum. It was the financial profile of a young woman hovering on the brink of insolvency. It was exactly what Brenda needed to see. I printed the single page on the cheap, coarse paper supplied by the kiosk, ensuring it possessed the authentic, tactile feel of a careless administrative printout. That evening, I returned to the farmhouse. I walked into the kitchen carrying my briefcase. Brenda was standing at the stove stirring a pot of soup. I opened my bag, pulled out a stack of legitimate utility bills, and deliberately slipped the forged bank statement into the middle of the pile. I left the papers scattered on the Formica Island, creating the illusion of a careless, exhausted employee dumping her mail. I walked upstairs to my bedroom and left the door cracked open exactly 2 inches. I stood in the dark, listening to the ambient sounds of the house. 10 minutes passed. Then I heard the soft, subtle shuffle of Brenda's slippers against the linoleum. I heard the faint rustle of paper sliding across the kitchen island. I held my breath. The silence stretched. Downstairs, Brenda was reading the forged document. She was looking at the bold black ink declaring my net worth to be a meager $412. I heard a soft, rhythmic sound emanate from the kitchen. It was a low humming. Brenda only hummed when she felt a deep, unshakable sense of superiority. The tension in the farmhouse evaporated overnight. The forged document acted as a psychological tranquilizer. Brenda no longer viewed my transfer as a threat. She viewed it as a temporary exile. She believed I was moving to an expensive coastal city with zero financial cushion to work a miserable clerical job. She calculated that the high cost of living would crush me within 6 months, forcing me to crawl back to Idaho, begging for my childhood bedroom and offering my paycheck to the family trust. She did not try to stop my departure. She facilitated it. I packed my life into 2 standard canvas suitcases. I left my winter coats, my high school yearbooks, and my childhood trinkets in the closet. Taking too much would shatter the illusion of a temporary venture. I needed to pack like a woman who planned on failing. On my final morning, Richard stood in the mudroom leaning against the doorframe while I pulled my luggage toward the exit. "Since you are leaving your junk in the bedroom, I will need to charge you a monthly storage fee," he stated, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a landlord shaking down a tenant. 15% of your new Boston paycheck should cover the footprint. I looked at the man who had tried to leverage my credit score for a tractor. "I will set up the routing numbers once I get settled, Dad," I replied, offering a blank, obedient stare. Jessica did not wake up to say goodbye. Tyler waved from the living room couch without looking away from the television screen. Brenda met me on the porch. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders, delivering a stiff, formal hug. "Do not let the city chew you up, Evie," she whispered, her tone laced with patronizing pity. "You always have a place here when things get too hard." I stepped back, picking up the handles of my suitcases. "Thank you, Mom," I said. I had arranged for a private car service to transport me to the Boise airport, abandoning my gray sedan in the driveway. The vehicle was legally registered in Richard's name anyway, a final tether I was happy to sever. I sat in the back of the car watching the familiar rusted mailboxes and peeling barns of Route 9 blur past the tinted window. I did not look back. 2 hours later, I sat in a window seat on a commercial airliner. The jet engines roared, vibrating through the cabin floor. The plane accelerated down the runway, pressing my spine into the thin upholstery of the seat. The wheels severed contact with the Idaho tarmac. We climbed through the heavy cloud cover, breaking into the blinding, unfiltered sunlight of the upper atmosphere. I ordered a sparkling water from the flight attendant. I rested my hand against the cold plastic of the tray table, feeling the steady pulse of my own heartbeat. I touched down in Massachusetts late that evening. The air was thick with the salty, damp chill of the Atlantic Ocean. I retrieved my canvas bags and walked out into the neon glow of the arrival terminal. I was standing on Eastern soil. I was enrolled in the most prestigious academic institution on the continent. I had executed the ghost extraction flawlessly. But as I stood on the curb waiting for a taxi, my cell phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated, displaying a new message in the Hamilton family group chat. The physical distance was achieved. The geographic barrier was established. Yet as the device buzzed against my hip, a cold, mechanical dread pooled in my stomach. I was safe in Boston, but how long before the tentacles of the Idaho farmhouse reached across the country to drag me down? The transition from the agricultural dust of Idaho to the academic epicenter of Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a jarring chronological whiplash. My mornings were no longer dictated by the heavy thud of Richard's steel-toed boots on yellow linoleum. Instead, I woke to the sharp, metallic clanging of the MBTA transit trains rattling along the tracks near my modest, off-campus studio apartment. I thrived in the rigorous, unforgiving environment of the university. The professors did not tolerate passivity. They demanded intellectual combat. I sat in vaulted lecture halls constructed of red brick and weathered limestone, surrounded by the offspring of senators and hedge fund managers. I contributed to fierce debates on macroeconomics and corporate regulatory frameworks. My previous life as a junior auditor managing fertilizer ledgers had hardened my analytical skills, providing a practical bedrock that my privileged classmates lacked. I was securing perfect marks while flying entirely under the radar. Yet the geographic separation did not sever the digital umbilical cord. My smartphone remained a buzzing, relentless anchor to the farmhouse on Route 9. The family group chat was a daily barrage of manufactured crises and entitled demands. Brenda complained about the rising cost of propane. Richard sent blurry photographs of broken tractor parts, demanding to know when my data entry paycheck would clear so I could route his storage fee to the trust. But Jessica was the most aggressive parasite. Her financial illiteracy was a bottomless sinkhole. It was a Tuesday afternoon in early November. The sky outside the towering arched windows of the Widener Library was a bruised slate gray, signaling the approaching New England winter. I sat at a massive solid oak reading table. The wood was deeply scarred, smoothed by a century of friction from heavy textbooks and frantic students. To my left sat a dense volume detailing federal tax loopholes. To my right sat my smartphone. The device vibrated against the hard oak surface. The screen lit up, displaying a text from Jessica. "Hey drone," read the message. "The Netflix login is blocked again. They raised the premium tier price. Since you have zero social life sitting in your freezing cubicle, you need to update the payment method. Do it before Tyler gets home. He wants to watch his shows." I stared at the glowing pixels. The sheer audacity of the demand was a psychological study in entitlement. My sister, a grown woman married to a man driving a $60,000 luxury pickup truck, was aggressively commanding me to fund her $16 streaming subscription. She justified the extortion by insulting my fabricated existence. The dramatic irony was a sharp, intoxicating narcotic. Jessica visualized me huddled in a miserable, windowless processing center, typing random numbers into an archaic database while wearing a cheap polyester sweater. She thought she was mocking a corporate failure. In reality, I was sitting in the largest university library system in the world, surrounded by the architectural grandeur of a multi-billion-dollar endowment. I was drafting a thesis on regulatory compliance that a visiting professor had already asked to submit to an academic journal. I was building a resume that would soon command a 6-figure signing bonus. I picked up the smartphone. I did not unleash my academic pedigree. I maintained the camouflage of the defeated drone. "Sorry, Jess," I typed, matching her casual disdain with artificial compliance. "The data entry quota was high today. Brain is fried. I updated the billing card. Enjoy the shows." I hit send and set the phone face down on the scarred oak table. The physical weight of the library, the towering stacks of literature, the smell of old paper and leather bindings, acted as a fortress. The oak absorbed the petty vibrations of the Idaho group chat, rendering their demands obsolete. I was untouchable. But the interaction left a strange metallic residue in my thoughts. I opened my laptop and stared at the blinking cursor on my thesis document. My concentration was fractured. Richard demanding storage fees. Jessica extorting streaming subscriptions. Tyler buying luxury vehicles while claiming the farm was drowning in operational debt. The numbers swirling around the Meridian property had never aligned with the narrative of agricultural poverty my parents aggressively peddled. I leaned back in the sturdy wooden chair. A quiet, dangerous curiosity began to bloom in the sterile logic centers of my brain. When Brenda had ambushed me with the county clerk notary, she forced me to sign the operating agreement for the newly formed Family Limited Liability Company. She did it to chain me to their liabilities. but the indemnification clause I had read before signing carried a dual function. As a legal co-trustee, I possessed unrestricted fiduciary access to the entity infrastructure. I had the legal authority to view the internal financial architecture of the Hamilton farm. I had never accessed the portal. During my final weeks in Idaho, I was too focused on engineering my physical extraction to risk leaving a digital footprint on their ledgers. But now I was sitting 2,000 miles away, shielded by a secure campus network. I opened a new browser tab. I navigated to the login page of the regional agricultural bank that serviced the Idaho property. I entered my Social Security number and the authentication details listed in my co-trustee documentation. The loading icon spun on the screen, a small blue circle rotating against a white background. The psychological barrier between the dutiful daughter and the corporate auditor dissolved completely. I was no longer Evie seeking parental approval. I was Evelyn Hamilton, executing a forensic financial review on a hostile entity. The banking portal loaded, the dashboard materialized, displaying the consolidated accounts linked to the family trust. I expected to see a chaotic mess of overdrawn checking accounts, maxed out credit lines, and desperate agricultural loans. I expected to find the mathematical proof of their incompetence. I expected to see the financial wreckage they constantly demanded I subsidize. I clicked on the primary operational ledger. The spreadsheet populated descending in chronological order, displaying the inflow and outflow of capital over the past 36 months. My eyes scanned the right-hand column tracking the running balance. The blood in my veins turned to ice water. The ambient noise of the Widener Library, the shuffling of pages, the distant coughing of students faded into a high-pitched, ringing silence. I gripped the edge of the heavy oak table. The wood felt suddenly unstable beneath my fingers. The farm was not failing. The farm was not experiencing a cash flow bottleneck. The farm was generating massive, unprecedented revenue. I scrolled through the deposits. There were massive injections of capital from commercial grain distributors. There were hefty subsidies deposited directly from federal agricultural programs. The gross income was staggering. But the outgoing transactions defied every standard operating procedure of a legitimate business. The operational expenses were artificially inflated. I tracked the routing numbers on the massive outgoing wire transfers. The funds were not being used to purchase fertilizer, repair irrigation systems, or pay property taxes. The money was being systematically siphoned out of the primary operational account and funneled into a secondary shadow entity. I ran a quick trace on the receiving routing number. It belonged to an offshore limited liability corporation registered in a notorious tax haven jurisdiction. Brenda, Richard, and Jessica were not just lazy entitled parasites. They were running a sophisticated embezzlement ring. They were claiming agricultural poverty to secure federal subsidies and extort my meager salary to cover their local overhead. Meanwhile, they were laundering the actual profits of the farm into an untouchable offshore account, hiding the revenue from the Internal Revenue Service to avoid paying corporate taxes. The sheer scale of the fraud was breathtaking. It was a calculated, multi-year criminal enterprise. But the cold, terrifying realization did not stop at their guilt. The implications slammed into my chest with the force of a physical blow. I stared at the top right corner of the banking dashboard. My name, Evelyn Hamilton, was listed plainly under the account ownership hierarchy. Brenda had forced me to sign the notary documents right before I left Idaho. She had framed it as estate planning, but the legal reality was much darker. By making me a co-trustee of the primary entity, she had tethered my name to the fraudulent ledgers. If the Internal Revenue Service audited the farm, they would track the offshore wire transfers. They would identify the tax evasion. And when the federal investigators pulled the corporate documents, they would see my signature on the operating agreement. I was not just a victim of domestic abuse. I was now technically a legal accomplice to a federal financial crime. I sat in the quiet grandeur of the Widener Library, surrounded by the elite architecture of my new life, staring at a digital screen that threatened to obliterate everything I had built. I had escaped the physical boundaries of the Idaho farmhouse, but Brenda had locked me inside a federal trap. I closed the laptop monitor. The mechanical click echoed loudly in my ears. I needed a countermeasure. I needed a legal shield to sever my liability before the government discovered the missing capital. But before I could formulate a defensive strategy, the smartphone, resting face down on the oak table, began to vibrate. The screen illuminated not with a text message, but with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed the name of a commercial agricultural equipment dealership located in Meridian, Idaho, the same dealership where Richard had previously attempted to purchase the used John Deere tractor. Why was a tractor salesman calling a data entry drone in Massachusetts? The glaring red font of the offshore routing numbers on my laptop screen held my gaze, burning an afterimage into my retinas. The Widener Library, with its towering vaulted ceilings and centuries of academic prestige, suddenly felt devoid of oxygen. I was staring at a digital crime scene, and my fingerprints had been meticulously planted all over the weapon. I pressed my palms flat against the scarred oak table, forcing my lungs to expand and contract at a steady, rhythmic pace. Panic is a useless emotion in an audit. It clouds the judgment and obscures the data. I needed to dissect the financial architecture of my family's betrayal with surgical precision. I opened a secondary spreadsheet on my monitor and began cross-referencing the transactions. The gross revenue generated by the Meridian property was staggering. Over the past 3 years, the farm had pulled in hundreds of thousands of dollars from commercial grain distributors. Alongside the private revenue, there were hefty recurring deposits from the federal government. Richard had successfully applied for specialized agricultural grants, citing drought conditions and crop failures. The money poured into the primary checking account in thick, healthy streams. But it never stayed there longer than 48 hours. I traced the outgoing capital. The methodology was surprisingly sophisticated for a man who wore muddy boots in the kitchen, which meant Brenda was the undisputed architect of the operation. She had established a network of phantom vendors. The ledgers were padded with fictitious invoices for heavy machinery repairs, imported seed, and specialized irrigation consulting. The payments for these fabricated services were wired directly out of the local Idaho bank. I ran a diagnostic trace on the receiving institution's identification code. The trail bypassed the American banking system entirely, terminating at a discrete financial holding company located in the Cayman Islands. My mother, my father, and my sister were laundering their agricultural profits. They were artificially driving the farm's taxable income down to zero, qualifying for federal hardship subsidies, and stashing the untaxed wealth offshore. The cruelty of the scheme was breathtaking. I remembered sitting at the dining room table in my cheap corporate blazer eating powdered mashed potatoes while Richard complained about the cost of diesel fuel. I remembered the month I emptied my meager savings to pay the county property tax because Brenda wept and claimed the bank was threatening foreclosure. They had extorted my entry-level salary to cover the visible local overhead, ensuring the community believed their narrative of rural poverty. Meanwhile, they were sitting on a mountain of untaxed cash, laughing at my obedience. But the anger was quickly eclipsed by a cold, paralyzing dread. The stakes had fundamentally shifted. This was no longer a domestic dispute over a burnt college acceptance letter. This was not a petty family drama about stolen car keys or unpaid streaming subscriptions. This was a major federal crime. I clicked over to the entity ownership documents housed within the banking portal. There, stamped in undeniable digital ink, was the limited liability agreement I had signed just weeks before escaping to Boston. Susan, the county clerk notary, had pressed her brass seal onto the paper, legally verifying my participation. Brenda had not just tricked me into absorbing their civil debt. She had executed a calculated, sociopathic frame-up. If the Internal Revenue Service flagged the offshore wires, they would launch a forensic investigation. The federal agents would pull the corporate registry. They would see Richard, a simple farmer. They would see Brenda, a rural homemaker. And then they would see me, a certified financial auditor, a professional trained in corporate tax reconciliation and asset management. To a federal prosecutor, the narrative would write itself. The parents lacked the technical expertise to construct an offshore laundering network. The auditor-daughter, holding fiduciary access and co-trustee status, was the obvious mastermind. Brenda had built a multi-million-dollar tax evasion ring and positioned me directly on the trap door. If the scheme collapsed, she would play the ignorant victim, and I would face a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. I closed my eyes. The sheer malice required to sacrifice your own child to the federal government for financial gain defied human comprehension. She had burned my Harvard letter to keep me as her servant, and she had forged my legal liability to keep me as her human shield. The instinct to flee, to pack my 2 canvas suitcases and disappear into a foreign country, flared in my chest. But running would only confirm my guilt in the eyes of the law. I could not simply mail a resignation letter to the trust. Relinquishing my co-trustee status now would not erase my historical signature from the fraudulent operating agreement. I needed a defense. I needed an ironclad, indisputable legal shield that would grant me total immunity when the federal hammer finally fell. I opened a secure, encrypted folder on my hard drive. I began the arduous, meticulous process of downloading the evidence. I saved every wire transfer receipt. I exported the falsified vendor invoices. I pulled the historical IP logs showing that the banking portal had been accessed exclusively from the Idaho router during the years the fraud was active, proving I was not the one orchestrating the transfers. I compiled gigabytes of raw, damning data, cataloging the exact mechanics of Brenda's criminal enterprise. I worked for 2 uninterrupted hours, my fingers flying across the quiet keyboard, my eyes scanning the red and black columns of numbers. The heavy oak tables of the Widener Library no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a war room. I was preparing to draft an anonymous whistleblower submission to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service. As a certified financial professional, I knew the protocol. Providing the government with a fully mapped, verified blueprint of offshore tax evasion would not only secure my legal immunity, but it would also trigger the Informant Reward Program. I was going to sever my liability, and I was going to let the federal government dismantle the farmhouse on Route 9. I initiated the final download sequence, pulling the master ledger for the current fiscal quarter. The progress bar crawled across the screen, securing my leverage bite by bite. The silence in the library was absolute. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the heavy burden of victimhood dissolve, replaced by the lethal, calculating energy of a survivor who had just acquired the nuclear codes. I reached forward to close the laptop monitor. At that exact moment, the smartphone resting on the table illuminated. The sudden burst of light caught my attention. The device began to vibrate against the wood, a low, urgent hum that shattered my concentration. I picked up the phone. The caller identification did not display a family member's name. It displayed a 10-digit number accompanied by a local Idaho business listing. It was a commercial agricultural equipment dealership located in Meridian, the exact location where my father had previously attempted to purchase a utility tractor. I stared at the glowing screen. I was a supposedly impoverished data entry clerk sitting in Massachusetts. There was zero logical reason for an Idaho heavy machinery vendor to be calling my personal cell phone in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, unless someone was standing in their showroom attempting to make a massive financial transaction using my identity. I watched the 10-digit Idaho number glow against the dark wood of the library table. The agricultural equipment dealership was calling my personal cell phone. It was a standard retail verification protocol. A diligent finance manager, sitting in a glass office 2,000 miles away, was attempting to confirm the identity of the primary applicant before releasing tens of thousands of dollars in heavy machinery. I did not swipe the green icon to accept the call. I pressed the side button, silencing the vibration. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end of the line. I gathered my belongings, sliding the laptop into my leather satchel. I walked out of the Widener Library and crossed the manicured green expanse of Harvard Yard. The crisp autumn wind carried the scent of fallen leaves and old masonry. I entered a towering limestone building and took my seat in an advanced macroeconomics seminar. The professor, a visiting scholar from the Federal Reserve, stood at the front of the tiered amphitheater, diagramming inflation metrics on a sprawling chalkboard. I opened my notebook. Then came the sharp, distinct ping. It resonated from my coat pocket, cutting through the academic drone of the lecture hall. It was not the generic chime of a text message or a social media update. It was a high-priority alert from the Experian credit monitoring application I had installed on my device years ago. I retrieved the phone and held it below the edge of the polished mahogany desk. The screen displayed a critical security notification. A hard credit inquiry had just been initiated. The requesting institution was Meridian Agricultural Supply. The requested amount was $22,000. Richard and Tyler were not just browsing the showroom. They were standing at a sales desk, forging my signature, and inputting my Social Security number into a commercial financing application. In my previous life, the obedient Idaho daughter would have panicked. She would have called Richard crying, begging him to stop ruining her financial future. She would have pleaded with Tyler to consider the consequences of leveraging her name. The Harvard auditor did not plead. The auditor executed a tactical strike. I quietly gathered my satchel and slipped out the heavy wooden doors at the back of the lecture hall. I walked down the echoing marble corridor until I found a secluded alcove near a set of stained glass windows. I bypassed my contact list entirely. I dialed the toll-free national hotline for the Experian Fraud Division. A representative answered the line. I provided my credentials, answering the security questions with sterile precision. I informed the agent that an unauthorized party was currently attempting to secure a line of credit using my identity in the state of Idaho. I requested an immediate, ironclad security freeze on my entire financial profile. The agent typed rapidly, confirming the protocol. Within 90 seconds, my credit was locked inside a digital vault. Any institution attempting to pull my score would receive a hard system denial. I did not stop at the credit freeze. A freeze blocks the transaction, but it does not establish a legal boundary. I opened the browser on my smartphone and navigated to the official website of the Meridian Police Department. I accessed the civilian portal for non-emergency crimes. I filled out the digital forms. I listed my father, Richard Hamilton, as the primary suspect in an ongoing case of attempted identity theft. I detailed the exact time, the location, and the dealership involved. I clicked Submit. The screen refreshed, generating an official 9-digit police report case number. I wrote the number down on a blank page in my notebook. 5 minutes later, my phone began to vibrate. The caller identification displayed Richard's personal cell phone number. I leaned against the cool limestone wall of the alcove. I pressed the green icon and held the device to my ear. Evie Richard barked. His voice was loud, echoing with the background noise of a busy retail showroom. The false authority in his tone was strained, masking a rising tide of panic. You need to call your bank right now. There is some kind of glitch in the system. The financing software at the dealership is locking us out, and the manager is saying your profile is flagged. I listened to the frantic edge in his breathing. He expected me to scramble. He expected me to apologize for the inconvenience and spend my afternoon untangling the administrative knot he had created. There is no glitch, Dad, I replied. My voice was a flat, calm line. The audio equivalent of a dial tone. What do you mean there is no glitch? Richard demanded, his anger flaring to cover his exposure. "The salesman is looking at me like I am a criminal. You need to fix this, Evie. We have the tractor loaded on the trailer." I froze the credit profile. "Dad," I said, "I received the hard inquiry notification 10 minutes ago." A heavy, stifling silence fell over the line. The background noise of the dealership seemed to vanish, leaving only the static hum of the cellular connection. "You froze it," he whispered, the realization dawning on him. "You unfreeze it right now, Evelyn. You are a co-trustee of this farm. You owe this to the family. Tyler is standing right here, and we look like fools." "I am not unfreezing anything," I stated, leaning my head back against the stone wall. "I did not authorize a $22,000 loan. You used my Social Security number without my physical presence or my verbal consent." "It is just a formality," Evie Richard sneered, trying to regain the high ground. "Do not be dramatic. We do this all the time." "I know you do," I replied, "but you will not do it again. Attempting to secure a commercial line of credit using a stolen identity is a federal crime." "I am your father," Richard shouted, his voice cracking. "It is not stolen." "The Meridian Police Department disagrees," I said. I let the sentence hang in the air, allowing the weight of the words to crush his remaining bravado. "What did you do?" he asked, his tone dropping into a hollow, terrified register. "I filed a formal report for identity fraud 10 minutes ago through the municipal portal," I explained, reading the digits from my notebook. "Case number 482091. I suggest you and Tyler leave the dealership before the finance manager realizes why the application was flagged and decides to call the patrol cars himself." "Evie, you cannot do this to us," Richard pleaded, the anger dissolving into raw desperation. "We are your blood. Do not contact me again regarding unauthorized financial transactions," I said. I ended the call. I did not wait for his response. I blocked his number in my device settings, ensuring his subsequent frantic attempts to reach me would be diverted into a silent digital void. I stood in the quiet alcove for a moment longer. The stained glass windows cast long, colorful shadows across the marble floor. I felt a profound, unfamiliar sensation settling into my bones. It was the feeling of total, unassailable control. The umbilical cord of financial exploitation was permanently severed. I had not just closed the vault. I had weaponized the bureaucracy against them. Richard and Tyler had walked into that dealership expecting to leverage my pristine credit history to fund their luxurious agricultural facade. Instead, they walked out as documented suspects in a police database, unable to purchase a spark plug on credit. I turned around and walked back into the macroeconomics seminar. I slipped into my seat, opened my notebook, and resumed transcribing the professor's lecture on fiscal policy. The numbers on the chalkboard made perfect sense. But as I underlined a complex equation, my mind drifted back to the farmhouse on Route 9. The family had lost their designated shock absorber. They had lost the ability to drain my savings. They had lost the power to forge my signature. The invisible financial cage they had maintained for 21 years was shattered. Abusers, however, do not simply accept defeat and walk away quietly. When their primary tools of control are stripped from their hands, they regress into deeper, more primal forms of manipulation. They pivot from extortion to emotional terrorism. Brenda would realize that the money was gone. She would realize that the distance had hardened my resolve. The polite fiction of the corporate data entry drone was failing to keep me compliant. If they could not reach my wallet, they would target my conscience. I knew an escalation was imminent. I knew they would attempt to drag me back to the dirt roads of Idaho using whatever sociopathic tactic they could invent. I just did not know how low my mother was willing to sink to ensure my return. The Boston winter melted into a damp, unpredictable spring. It was April of my senior year at Harvard. The campus was humming with the frantic, caffeinated energy that always precedes final exams. The air smelled of blooming cherry blossoms and the ozone output of library laser printers. I was 2 weeks away from completing my undergraduate thesis and defending it before a panel of tenured economists. I had secured a post-graduation offer from a Tier 1 corporate law firm in the financial district. The trajectory of my life was a steep upward slope. The farmhouse in Idaho, however, was descending into chaos. Since the incident at the equipment dealership, the communication from my family had devolved from demanding to erratic. I had maintained the block on Richard's number. Jessica occasionally sent venomous texts criticizing my selfishness, which I ignored. Brenda remained disturbingly quiet. The silence was not a surrender. It was the tactical retreat of a predator, calculating a new angle of attack. They had lost the ability to exploit my credit. They knew I was geographically out of reach. The only remaining weapon in their arsenal was emotional terrorism. They needed a crisis profound enough to bypass my logic and trigger a primal, familial duty. I was sitting at a corner table in a local coffee shop near Harvard Square. The table was littered with index cards, highlighted legal statutes, and an empty mug. My laptop was open, displaying a complex graph of international trade tariffs. My phone illuminated. It was not a text message. It was an incoming call from Tyler. Tyler never called me. Our entire communication history consisted of him demanding chores or mocking my fabricated corporate existence. For his name to appear on my screen indicated a deliberate, orchestrated event. I picked up the phone and accepted the call, pressing the device to my ear. Evie, Tyler shouted. His voice was breathless, layered with a frantic, manufactured panic. It was the performance of a man executing a script. "You need to get on a plane right now. It is your mother." I did not flinch. I kept my eyes focused on the trade tariff graph. "What happened, Tyler?" She collapsed in the kitchen. Tyler stammered, rushing through his lines. "It is a severe cardiac event. The paramedics just took her to the Meridian Regional Hospital. Richard is riding in the ambulance. Jessica is hysterical. The doctors are saying it looks like a massive blockage." I held the phone steady. The narrative was designed to elicit a visceral reaction. A daughter receiving news of her mother's impending death is expected to drop everything, abandon her academic responsibilities, max out a credit card on a last-minute flight, and rush to the bedside. "You need to come home, Evie." Tyler continued pressing the manufactured urgency. "Richard cannot handle the farm operations by himself while she is in intensive care. You are the co-trustee. We need you here to manage the transition and sign the medical power of attorney documents." She might not make it through the night. The inclusion of the farm operations and the co-trustee title betrayed the lie. Even in the midst of a supposed life-or-death medical crisis, their primary focus remained on tethering me back to the administrative control of the property. They were not calling an estranged daughter to say goodbye to her mother. They were trying to lure an auditor back to manage their books. "I will look into flights, Tyler," I said, my voice maintaining a flat, sterile tone. "Keep me updated on her vitals." I ended the call. I did not close my laptop. I did not run to the airport. I remained seated in the coffee shop, breathing in the scent of roasted espresso beans. If the cardiac event was genuine, the logistical nightmare would be immense. But my survival in that farmhouse had trained me to approach every family statement as a potential fraud. The burden of proof rested entirely on their shoulders. I opened a new tab on my browser. I searched for the main switchboard number of the Meridian Regional Hospital. I dialed the digits on my phone. A hospital operator answered the line. I identified myself as an immediate family member and requested the room number and patient status for Brenda Hamilton, citing a recent emergency admittance. The operator placed me on a brief hold. Soft elevator music played through the speaker. A minute later, she returned. "I am sorry, ma'am," the operator stated. "I have checked the emergency intake logs and the intensive care registry. We do not have a patient by the name of Brenda Hamilton currently admitted to this facility." "Thank you," I replied. "I must have been misinformed." I disconnected the call. The sterile confirmation washed over me. The cardiac event was a complete fabrication. It was a sociopathic lie engineered to rip me out of my final exams, derail my graduation, and drag me back to the dirt roads of Idaho. They were willing to fake a mortal illness to reassert their dominance. But knowing it was a lie was not enough. I needed to document the deception. I needed to crush the narrative before they could escalate it further. I opened the social media application on my phone. Jessica was a chronic oversharer. She treated her online presence as a continuous broadcast of her daily life, posting mundane details to project an illusion of affluence and leisure. If Brenda was truly fighting for her life in an intensive care unit, Jessica would be broadcasting her grief to gather sympathy. I navigated to Jessica's public profile. Her most recent post had been uploaded exactly 22 minutes ago. It was a photograph taken inside a local diner in downtown Meridian. The lighting was poor, illuminating the faux leather booths and the cheap laminated menus. The image focused on a massive plate of food resting on a Formica table. Sitting directly across the table, holding a stainless steel fork and looking perfectly healthy, was Brenda Hamilton. She was not hooked up to a ventilator. She was not riding in an ambulance. She was wearing a floral blouse and smiling at the camera. Resting on the plate in front of her was a massive, greasy chicken fried steak smothered in a thick layer of white country gravy. I zoomed in on the photograph. The details were undeniable. The timestamp was fresh, and resting near Brenda's elbow beneath the edge of the heavy ceramic plate was a laminated diner menu. I could clearly see a dark, translucent grease stain seeping into the paper, a physical testament to the reality of their Tuesday afternoon lunch. My mother was consuming deep-fried meat, while my brother-in-law was calling me, claiming she was dying of a heart attack. The sheer audacity of the lie was pathological. They believed I was so easily manipulated, so desperate for familial connection, that I would abandon my life in Boston without verifying the facts. They thought they could yank the leash and watch me stumble. I took a screenshot of the image, ensuring the timestamp and Brenda's smiling face were perfectly captured. I opened the Hamilton family group chat. The thread had been silent for weeks. I selected the screenshot from my photo gallery and attached it to a new message. I typed a single, concise sentence. Glad her heart is holding up well enough for the chicken fried steak. I hit send. I watched the small icon indicate the message had been successfully delivered to Richard, Jessica, and Tyler. I did not wait for the inevitable explosion of backpedaling excuses or hysterical accusations. I did not care what lies they would invent to explain the discrepancy. I opened the settings on my phone and placed the entire group thread on a permanent mute. I silenced all incoming notifications from their area code. I set the phone face down on the coffee shop table. I picked up my highlighter and returned my attention to the graph of international trade tariffs. My focus was absolute. My breathing was steady. The final attempt to break my academic career had shattered against a wall of digital evidence. They had tried to extort my credit. They had tried to trap me with legal liabilities. They had faked a medical emergency. Every trap they constructed, I had systematically dismantled using the very auditing skills they mocked. I had survived the gauntlet. But survival is a passive state. Survival is merely outlasting the attacks. I was weeks away from receiving a degree from Harvard University. I was about to step into a corporate arena where I would command power and capital. I was no longer the frightened girl crying in the barn loft. I was a fully actualized weapon. My mother had burned my acceptance letter to keep me as her servant. She had forced me to sign fraudulent documents to act as her federal shield. She had lied, manipulated, and stolen to preserve her rural illusion. I had survived their cage. Now it was time to make them pay for the construction materials. I needed a strategy that would permanently dissolve their power and secure my absolute, unassailable freedom. How does an auditor dismantle a fraudulent empire from 2,000 miles away, leaving the architects to face the federal consequences alone? May arrived in Cambridge bringing the thick, humid warmth typical of a New England spring. I submitted my undergraduate thesis on a Tuesday. The panel of tenured economists reviewed my defense and awarded it the highest possible distinction. The academic marathon was over. The narrative I had fed my family was that of a struggling corporate drone living on the edge of poverty. The narrative I had fed myself when I first arrived in Massachusetts was that of a scholarship student surviving on institutional financial aid. Neither story represented the current truth. Financial aid packages at elite universities are generous, but they do not cover every living expense, travel cost, or legal fee required to untangle a lifetime of domestic sabotage. To truly secure my independence, I needed capital. I needed the kind of wealth that creates an impenetrable fortress. I found that wealth hidden inside the very trap Brenda had designed to destroy me. Months prior, when I sat in the Widener Library staring at the offshore routing numbers on my monitor, I did not just panic. I did not simply close the laptop and hope the federal government would overlook my forged signature on the family trust documents. An auditor understands that the first person to report a financial crime controls the narrative. The Internal Revenue Service maintains a specialized division dedicated to uncovering tax evasion. It is called the Whistleblower Office. The federal code contains a specific provision incentivizing individuals with insider knowledge to expose high-level corporate fraud. If the intelligence leads to the successful recovery of hidden taxable assets, the informant receives a mandatory percentage of the collected funds. I spent 3 weeks compiling a digital dossier. I indexed every fabricated invoice Brenda had generated. I mapped the exact chronological flow of capital from the local Idaho bank to the Cayman Islands holding company. I drafted a comprehensive summary explaining how my signature had been coerced under the guise of standard estate planning. I submitted the entire encrypted package through the official government portal, utilizing my credentials as a certified financial professional to validate the intelligence. Federal investigators do not ignore airtight forensic blueprints. The audit was launched quietly. The government froze the offshore accounts and initiated the asset recovery protocols before Richard or Brenda even noticed a delay in their banking portals. Because my documentation was the sole catalyst for the recovery, the bureaucratic gears turned with surprising speed. A federal wire transfer cleared into my secure Boston checking account during the winter semester. It was a staggering sum of money. The reward represented a direct percentage of the wealth Brenda had stolen from the taxpayers and hoarded for her own vanity. The ironies of the situation were profound. The money she skimmed to buy Jessica luxury items and fund Tyler's automotive habits was seized by the federal government and handed directly to the daughter she tried to enslave. Brenda's greed paid for my tuition. Her tax evasion funded my housing. Her financial malice financed my Ivy League degree. I had weaponized her own criminality to purchase my freedom. The second week of May brought the commencement ceremony. Harvard Yard was transformed into a sea of folding chairs and canvas tents. The air echoed with the sounds of a brass band and the collective chatter of wealthy, proud families. Fathers in tailored suits photographed their children. Mothers wiped tears of joy from their cheeks. I stood near the steps of the Widener Library wearing a black academic gown and a crimson sash. I was entirely alone. There were no homemade signs bearing my name. There were no celebratory dinners reserved at high-end restaurants. I held a leather folder containing my official degree. I ran my thumb over the crisp, embossed seal of the university, pressed deep into the heavy parchment. The tactile sensation of the raised paper was a physical anchor. Below my printed name, the Latin phrase magna cum laude was inscribed in dark ink, highest honors. A younger version of me, the girl who checked the rural mailbox every afternoon, might have felt a hollow ache watching the other families celebrate. She might have grieved the empty chairs in my non-existent cheering section. The woman, standing in the sunlight, felt no such sorrow. Grief requires the loss of something valuable. You do not mourn the absence of wardens. You do not weep for the people who built your cage. I had secured my education, my capital, and my future. I possessed a pristine credit score, an untouchable bank account, and a lucrative job offer waiting in the financial district. I had executed the invisible revenge from 2,000 miles away, leaving them to drown in the federal consequences of their own actions. But the operation was not finished. The Internal Revenue Service was finalizing the penalties, and the farm was days away from a catastrophic administrative freeze. Submitting the whistleblower report protected me from criminal prosecution, but it did not automatically remove my name from the limited liability paperwork Brenda had filed with the county clerk. To sever the final legal tether, I needed to dissolve the corporate entity. Dissolution required a notarized signature delivered in the physical presence of the remaining trustees. The law demanded a face-to-face interaction. I could not simply mail the documents and trust Brenda to process them. She would destroy the paperwork, just as she had burned my college acceptance letter. I had to deliver the execution order myself. I had to watch the illusion shatter. I packed my canvas suitcases, leaving my sparse college apartment behind. I ordered a private car to the airport and boarded a commercial flight heading west. The altitude swallowed the eastern seaboard, trading the ocean for the endless grid of the American Midwest. I landed in Boise under a pale, overcast sky. I bypassed the budget rental counter and walked to the premium transportation desk. I presented my corporate credit card and secured the keys to a sleek, heavy black SUV. I walked out into the cool Idaho air and unlocked the vehicle. The engine turned over with a deep, quiet rumble, a stark contrast to the rattling sedan Jessica used to steal from me. I pulled out of the airport parking lot and merged onto the highway. The familiar landscape of my childhood rushed past the tinted windows. I aimed the vehicle toward the dirt roads of Meridian. It was time to go home. The black SUV glided over the asphalt, leaving the highway and turning onto the long stretch of county highway that cut through Meridian. The scenery was a harsh reminder of the stasis I had escaped. The land was flat, segmented by barbed wire fencing and irrigation ditches. I drove past the local agricultural supply warehouse where Brenda had demanded I work. I drove past the community college where I had spent 2 years balancing ledgers to earn a basic accounting certificate. These were the monuments of my intended failure. I signaled and turned onto the unpaved dirt road leading to the Hamilton property. The heavy tires of the rented vehicle crushed the loose gravel, kicking up a cloud of pale dust in the rearview mirror. I approached the farmhouse. From a distance, the property maintained the rustic charm Brenda aggressively curated for the community. But as I drew closer, the veneer dissolved, revealing the rot beneath the surface. The white paint on the siding was peeling away in long, curled strips, exposing the gray, weathered wood underneath. The gutters were choked with decaying leaves. A rusted tractor attachment sat abandoned near the barn, partially swallowed by overgrown weeds. The physical decay was a direct reflection of their financial reality. They had hoarded hundreds of thousands of dollars in an offshore account, but they were too arrogant to invest a single dime back into the infrastructure that generated their wealth. They preferred the aesthetic of poverty because it justified their extortion. I parked the SUV near the edge of the driveway, ensuring the sleek, modern lines of the vehicle were clearly visible from the kitchen window. I turned off the ignition. The silence of the rural afternoon pressed against the tinted glass. I reached into the passenger seat and unzipped the garment bag resting there. I slipped the heavy black graduation gown over my shoulders. The fabric settled around my frame, carrying the physical weight of my academic labor. I adjusted the tailored collar. I lifted the thick silk sash the color of dark crimson and draped it around my neck. The gold-embroidered letters spelling Veritas caught the afternoon sunlight filtering through the windshield. I secured the magna cum laude honors cords, letting the braided tassels hang against the dark fabric. I did not feel ridiculous sitting in a parked car on a dirt road wearing formal academic regalia. I felt like a soldier donning ceremonial armor before accepting a surrender. I grabbed the sleek leather portfolio from the console. I stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the house. The gravel crunched under my boots. I climbed the wooden steps of the front porch. The boards groaned under my weight, a familiar sound I had heard every day of my childhood. I did not raise my hand to knock. I did not ring the doorbell. I was a legal co-trustee of the property. I did not require permission to enter my own assets. I reached for the keypad on the heavy side door. I entered the 5-digit access code Richard had installed years ago. The deadbolt clicked open with a sharp mechanical thud. I pushed the door open. The crisp rustle of the heavy graduation silk brushed against the peeling paint of the doorframe as I crossed the threshold. I stepped directly into the dining room. The scene was a stagnant, frozen tableau of the life I had abandoned. It was Sunday afternoon. The table was set with Brenda's good porcelain and white lace tablecloth. Richard sat at the head of the table, a napkin tucked into his collar. Tyler slouched in his chair, tapping his phone screen. Jessica sat across from him, holding a wine glass. Brenda stood near the sideboard, holding a serving spoon. They were mid-conversation, likely complaining about the cost of livestock feed or fabricating a new crisis to demand my non-existent corporate salary. My sudden appearance derailed the ambient noise instantly. The conversation snapped shut like a severed wire. Brenda dropped the serving spoon. It hit the wooden sideboard with a loud clatter. Richard's jaw went slack. Tyler lowered his phone, his eyes widening as his brain struggled to process the visual data. Jessica froze the wine glass suspended inches from her mouth. I stood in the doorway, the dark fabric of the gown absorbing the light in the room. The crimson sash screamed against the muted beige wallpaper of the farmhouse. The visual collision of my undeniable elite reality invading their toxic, manufactured space paralyzed the room. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. They expected a defeated, exhausted data entry clerk begging for her childhood bedroom. They were staring at a highly decorated Ivy League graduate holding a leather portfolio. The silence stretched, pulling the oxygen out of the air. Evie Richard managed to stammer, his voice thick with confusion. "What are you doing here? Why are you dressed like that?" I did not answer him. I kept my posture rigid, my expression a flat, sterile mask. I walked slowly toward the dining table, the silk fabric whispering with every step. I stopped near the edge of the lace tablecloth, directly across from Brenda. Brenda's eyes darted rapidly, tracking the gold embroidery on the sash. The panic flared in her pupils, quickly masked by a desperate, defensive anger. She realized the narrative of my failure was shattered. She realized the cage was empty. "What is this?" Evelyn Brenda demanded, her voice shrill, attempting to reassert her matriarchal authority. "Is this some kind of joke? Did you buy that costume online to mock us? You think wearing a fake robe changes the fact that you abandoned your family for a miserable cubicle job?" She was fighting to preserve the illusion, fighting to convince the rest of the table that I was still the inferior subsidiary she had designated me to be. "Harvard rejected you years ago, Evie," Jessica chimed in, slamming her wine glass down on the table. "We all know that. Stop embarrassing yourself. Take that stupid thing off." The psychological defense mechanisms were firing rapidly. Denial, mockery, aggression. They were desperate to overwrite the truth standing right in front of them. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I let the silence hang for a long, brutal moment, allowing their pathetic insults to echo in the quiet room. I pressed my thumb against the brass clasp of my leather portfolio. It opened with a sharp, heavy click. The sound cut through the dining room like a gavel. I reached inside the leather envelope. The time for academic posturing was over. It was time to introduce the physical evidence of their betrayal. It was time to place the charred ghost of my past directly onto the white lace tablecloth. The brass clasp clicked, echoing in the dining room. Brenda crossed her arms, her posture defensive, chin tilted upward in a desperate bid to maintain the high ground. Harvard, she spat, the word twisting in her mouth like a physical contaminant. They rejected you years ago. You are delusional, Evelyn. You spent 2 years at the community college learning how to use a calculator. You are a clerk. The air shifted, pulling my mind backward through a narrow, dark corridor of memory. I was standing in the kitchen 7 years prior. It was the morning of my 18th birthday. The Idaho sun was pale, filtering through the dust-streaked windows. There was no cake. There were no presents. There was only Brenda, standing by the counter, holding a single sheet of printer paper. It was an employment application for the regional feed and seed warehouse. I remember the smell of stale coffee brewing in the corner. I remember the rough, cheap texture of the paper when she pressed it into my hands. I remember the exact pitch of her voice, laced with that artificial, suffocating pity. "Elite places do not want us, Evie," she had whispered, patting my cheek with a cold, dry palm. "They sent the digital rejections this morning. All of them. It is time to face reality. Know your place, stay close, and pull your weight." I had taken the paper. I had swallowed the devastating grief, burying my academic ambition in the muddy soil of the family farm. I had allowed her to define my perimeter. The memory evaporated, returning me to the present. I looked at the woman standing by the sideboard. Her face was tight, lined with the stress of maintaining a decade of relentless deception. I reached inside the leather portfolio. My fingers bypassed the thick stack of legal documents resting at the back, finding the smooth, rigid surface of the clear plastic sleeve I had hidden inside a hollowed-out textbook years ago. I pulled the sleeve into the light. The room remained silent. I stepped forward, closing the distance between the doorway and the dining table. I moved with deliberate, unhurried precision. I stopped directly across from my mother. I lowered my hand and placed the plastic sleeve flat on the table, resting it right beside the porcelain gravy boat. The contrast was jarring. The pristine white lace tablecloth, woven with intricate floral patterns, served as a sterile canvas for the object inside the sleeve. It was the original, heavy cream cardstock envelope. The right edge was violently charred, the paper carbonized into brittle, flaking soot. But the left side remained untouched, displaying the melted red wax seal and the crisp, undeniable crimson shield of the university. Stamped clearly across the center, beneath the Latin motto, was my full name and the year 2018. I kept my eyes locked on Brenda. I delivered the sentence with a cold, flat cadence. "You did not burn it long enough, Mom." The physical reaction was instantaneous and profound. The blood drained from Brenda's face, leaving her skin a mottled, ashen gray. Her mouth opened, but her vocal cords refused to engage. The serving spoon she had dropped earlier seemed to mock her from the sideboard. She stared at the soot-stained paper, her pupils dilated in pure, unfiltered terror. Richard leaned forward, squinting at the crest, his thick eyebrows furrowed as his brain slowly translated the visual evidence. Tyler stopped tapping his phone. Jessica lowered her wine glass, her smug, abrasive sneer melting into a mask of blank confusion. I did not allow them time to formulate a defense. I launched the forensic dissection of her crime, speaking with the clinical detachment of a prosecutor, outlining a timeline to a jury. "You changed the password to the college application email portal the day after you handed me that warehouse application," I stated, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. I assumed it was a glitch. I assumed my future was over. But an auditor learns to recognize the difference between a system error and a cover-up. "You locked me out of the account so you could delete the digital congratulations before I ever saw them." Brenda took a trembling step backward, her spine colliding with the wooden edge of the sideboard. She gripped the polished mahogany to keep her knees from buckling. And then the physical package arrived, I continued, gesturing to the charred envelope resting on the lace fabric. You hovered over the mailbox on Route 9 like a guard dog. You intercepted the delivery. You carried my acceptance letter behind the barn, threw it into Tyler's rusted trash barrel, and struck a match. You intended to incinerate my escape route. But it rained that evening. The wet oak leaves plastered the envelope to the bottom of the metal drum, extinguishing the flames before they could reach my name. No, Brenda whispered, the syllable weak, trembling in the quiet air. No, that is not. I found it 3 years later, I interrupted, cutting off her pathetic attempt at denial. I cut my hand on the rusted rim of the barrel, pushing down a cardboard box. I pulled my future out of your garbage. I photographed it. I hid it. I bought a burner laptop with untraceable cash, reapplied in the middle of the night while you slept, and secured my admission. The data entry job in Boston was a fabrication designed to pacify your ego. The bank statement showing $400 was a forgery, printed at a pharmacy kiosk to convince you I was a failure. The matriarchal narrative collapsed entirely. The invisible architecture of her dominance, the carefully constructed reality where she ruled as the benevolent provider while I served as the grateful subordinate, shattered into microscopic fragments. She was exposed. The entire table now knew she was not a protector. She was a warden who had systematically sabotaged her own daughter to secure free labor and a secondary income stream. Richard looked at his wife, his expression twisting into a complex knot of realization and secondary panic. Jessica stared at the table, her shallow arrogance completely neutralized by the undeniable proof of my success. Tyler simply looked away, staring at the beige wallpaper. When a predator loses the advantage of stealth and authority, they inevitably pivot to the final strategy of the guilty. They deploy the shield of victimhood. Brenda's lower lip began to quiver. Her eyes filled with rapid, manufactured tears. She released her grip on the sideboard and took a hesitant, trembling step toward me. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, a pantomime of maternal desperation. "Evie, please," she cried, her voice cracking with theatrical sorrow. "You have to understand. You have to look at this from my perspective. The farm was struggling. We were drowning in debt. We needed your paycheck to keep the lights on. If you had left for the East Coast, we would have lost everything. We are your family. Family makes sacrifices for each other. I did it because I loved you. I did it to keep us together." The performance was grotesque. She was attempting to rebrand a calculated, multi-year psychological kidnapping as an act of familial devotion. She wanted me to pity the woman who threw my life into a fire. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, tracking down her pale cheeks. She reached a hand out across the table, her fingers trembling, silently begging me to bridge the gap, to forgive the betrayal, to revert to the compliant, empathetic daughter she had trained me to be. I looked at her outstretched hand. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional reservoir was permanently drained. I did not come back to Idaho to demand an apology, I said, my tone dropping to a quiet, lethal register. I did not fly 2,000 miles to show you a piece of burnt paper, or to listen to you justify a kidnapping. The envelope was just the prologue. Brenda's hand froze in midair. Her fake tears stalled. The confusion returned to her eyes, mingling with a fresh, deeper wave of terror. If the revelation of the destroyed Harvard acceptance was not the primary purpose of my invasion, the impending alternative had to be infinitely worse. I reached back into the open leather portfolio, my fingers wrapped around the thick stack of blue-backed legal documents resting inside. "The past is already settled, Mom," I stated, pulling the heavy paperwork into the sunlight. "Now we are going to discuss the future. Or more accurately, your lack of one." I pulled the heavy stack of paperwork from the leather portfolio. The blue cardstock backing was stiff and formal. I held it in my hands, letting the physical weight of their impending destruction settle over the room. Brenda lowered her trembling hand. Her tears evaporated, drying instantly under the harsh fluorescent kitchen lights. She recognized the blue binding. It was the same legal stationery Susan, the county clerk notary, had used when they ambushed me at this very table years ago. When you forced me to sign that operating agreement, you thought you were attaching a permanent ball and chain to my ankle, I said, keeping my voice analytical and precise. You wanted my corporate salary to serve as a guarantor for your agricultural debt. But you failed to read the bylaws of the entity you created. A co-trustee with fiduciary access does not merely absorb liability. A co-trustee wields unilateral administrative authority. I separated the top document from the stack. I dropped it onto the white lace tablecloth, allowing it to cover the charred Harvard envelope. Look at the bottom line, I instructed. Richard leaned over the table. His eyes scanned the dense legal text. Resting at the bottom of the final page was my name. Beside it was a fresh notary stamp. My signature was executed in thick blue ink. The strokes were bold and deliberate, pressing deep into the paper, leaving a permanent, tactile groove. That is a formal Articles of Dissolution certificate, I stated. I filed it with the Idaho Secretary of State on Friday morning. The Hamilton Family Limited Liability Company no longer exists. The operational licenses are revoked. The vendor credit accounts are terminated. You cannot buy seed. You cannot sell grain. You cannot secure a loan for a spark plug. The farm as a corporate entity is dead. Tyler pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping harshly against the floor. You cannot do that, he shouted, his face flushing dark red. I have a truck financed through that company. The dealership will repossess it. The commercial financing tied to the LLC is void, Tyler I replied, without looking at him. The tow truck was dispatched an hour ago. I suggest you clean out the glove compartment. Richard gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. You destroyed our livelihood, Evie, he growled, his voice vibrating with a sudden, volatile rage. We will sue you. We will take you to civil court and strip you down to pennies. I peeled the second document from the stack. I dropped it directly on top of the dissolution paperwork. It was a formal government dispatch bearing the official seal of the United States Treasury Department. You will not have the liquidity to retain a civil attorney, Dad, I said, because you are currently the primary target of a federal criminal investigation. Brenda gasped, a sharp intake of air that sounded like a physical puncture. She stared at the Treasury seal. I audited your books from a library in Massachusetts. I continued pacing the revelation with a steady, relentless rhythm. I found the phantom vendors. I tracked the fraudulent invoices. I traced the outgoing wire transfers from the local bank to the holding company in the Cayman Islands. You were claiming agricultural poverty to collect taxpayer subsidies while laundering hundreds of thousands of dollars offshore to evade corporate taxes. You forced me to sign the operating agreement to frame me as your accomplice, I explained. If the government ever knocked on the door, you planned to offer the financial auditor daughter as the sacrificial lamb. It was a brilliant strategy, but it contained a fatal flaw. You gave a certified financial professional unrestricted access to an unsecured crime scene. I did not just remove my name from the trust, I said. I downloaded every ledger, every receipt, and every IP address log showing the transfers originated from this farmhouse router. I compiled the evidence into a forensic dossier and submitted it to the whistleblower office of the Internal Revenue Service. The room entered a state of terminal shock. They were no longer angry. They were staring at the raw, terrifying reality of federal prison. The government seized the offshore accounts 3 months ago, I said, letting the truth land with devastating force. Because my intelligence was the sole catalyst for the asset recovery, the federal code mandated a reward. A percentage of the recovered taxes was deposited directly into my personal accounts. Your offshore embezzlement ring paid for my final 2 years of tuition. You financed my Ivy League degree. Brenda slumped against the sideboard, sliding down the wooden panels until she hit the floor. She brought her hands up to her face, covering her eyes. She was not faking the tears now. She was weeping for her own impending incarceration. Richard stood, paralyzed, a broken man staring at the ruins of his arrogant kingdom. Jessica sat rigid, her wineglass forgotten, facing a future devoid of stolen subsidies. I picked up my leather portfolio. I zipped it shut. The sound was crisp and final. "You burned my first letter to keep me here," I said, looking down at my mother. "I wrote this one to make sure I never return." I turned my back on the dining room. I did not wait for their apologies. I did not wait for their excuses or their threats. I walked through the mudroom and pushed the side door open. I stepped out onto the porch. The heavy wooden screen door swung shut behind me, slamming into the frame with a loud, resonant crack that echoed across the dirt driveway. I walked down the wooden steps. The Idaho air felt lighter, devoid of the suffocating pressure that had haunted my childhood. I opened the door of the black SUV and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the quiet, powerful rumble vibrating through the steering wheel. I shifted the vehicle into drive. I drove away from the farmhouse, watching the peeling paint and the rusted burn barrel disappear in the rearview mirror. I did not look back again. 12 hours later, I was sitting in a wide leather seat in the first-class cabin of a commercial airliner, soaring 30,000 feet above the American Midwest. The cabin was quiet, illuminated by soft overhead lighting. A flight attendant handed me a tall glass of sparkling water. I took a slow sip. The cold liquid rushed down my throat. I traced the cool condensation forming on the outside of the glass, letting the simple physical sensation ground me in the present moment. I was flying back to Boston. I had a spacious apartment waiting in the city and a lucrative legal career beginning in 2 weeks. My credit was pristine. My conscience was clear. People will often tell you that family is an unbreakable bond. They will insist that blood demands endless forgiveness and infinite sacrifice. They will label you selfish when you refuse to set yourself on fire to keep them warm. But standing in that Harvard library, looking at the evidence of my own intended destruction, I learned the most valuable lesson of my life. Loyalty is not a suicide pact. When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to build a cage, you do not owe them the courtesy of remaining inside it. True revenge does not require screaming matches or bitter physical altercations. True revenge is quiet. It is methodical. It is the realization that your abusers are small, incompetent people who rely on your compliance to survive. When you withdraw that compliance, their entire universe collapses. You simply outgrow the people who tried to bury you. You secure your perimeter, you document their malice, and you walk out the door. You let gravity do its job. That is my story. One rusted burn barrel, one forged bank statement, and the thick blue ink of a signature that dismantled an empire. If you are currently serving as the foundation for a family that disrespects your life, let this be the sign to pack up your blueprints and step out of the way. Let the roof cave in. Your peace is worth more than their comfort. Thank you for listening. Subscribe for more Aura Vengeance, and I will see you in the next one. The image of a charred, soot-stained envelope resting on a pristine white lace tablecloth is more than just the climax of a gripping narrative. It is a stark, haunting mirror held up to the darkest corners of familial obligation. When we listen to Evelyn's story, the immediate reaction is outrage at the financial fraud and the sheer audacity of the betrayal. But beneath the cold, calculating revenge and the satisfying click of that brass portfolio, there is a profound and quiet tragedy about the fundamental failure of parenthood. In American culture, the traditional family structure is often idealized as the ultimate sanctuary. It is supposed to be the bedrock of our society, rooted in the enduring values of mutual support, hard work, and shared sacrifice. From a young age, children are taught the virtues of loyalty. We are instructed to pull our weight, to respect our elders, and to honor the roof over our heads. These are beautiful, vital principles. But what happens when that beautiful concept is corrupted? What happens when the language of love and duty is weaponized to mask exploitation? Richard and Brenda Hamilton did not run a home. They ran a holding company. They viewed their daughter not as a human being with a distinct destiny, but as a domestic utility. And in doing so, they violated the most sacred contract of parenthood. True family responsibility is not about creating a closed loop of dependency. A parent's fundamental duty is to prepare a child for the world, to equip them with the resilience, the ethics, and the confidence to build their own empire. It is the arduous task of raising a human being who no longer needs you. When Brenda intercepted that college acceptance letter and struck a match, she did not just destroy a piece of heavy cream cardstock. She attempted to assassinate her daughter's potential. She lied to keep her close, wrapping her deception in the false warmth of maternal concern. But a love that relies on deception is not love at all. It is captivity. Honesty is the mortar that holds the foundation of any family together. If parents cannot be honest with their children about the world, and more importantly, about the child's own capabilities, the entire structure eventually rots from the inside out. When you lie to a child to shrink their horizon, you teach them that their ambition is a threat and that their success is a betrayal. This brings us to the crucial pillar of fairness. Traditional family structures thrive on equity, but they collapse under the crushing weight of favoritism. We saw this in the stark contrast between how Evelyn and Jessica were treated. Jessica was the show pony, indulged and shielded from consequence, permitted to swipe car keys and demand streaming subscriptions while drowning in debt. Evelyn was the workhorse, expected to shoulder the financial and emotional burdens of the entire household. In raising children, fairness does not necessarily mean identical paths or identical financial distributions. True fairness is an equal distribution of respect. It is the recognition that every child holds inherent worth outside of what they can provide for the parents. When a mother and father measure one child's value by their utility, what they can pay for, what chores they can absorb, what legal liabilities they can stomach, they strip that child of their humanity. They teach the golden child to become a parasite, and they teach the scapegoat to become a prisoner. Neither child actually wins. To avoid this tragedy, parents must cultivate deep emotional awareness. Emotional awareness requires the humility to see your child for who they truly are, rather than who you need them to be. Evelyn possessed a brilliant, analytical, and stoic mind. A healthy, emotionally aware parent would have recognized that brilliance, celebrated it, and proudly sent her off to Massachusetts, even if it meant an empty chair at the Sunday dinner table. But emotional blindness, fueled by selfishness, views a child's independence as a personal insult. Long-term guidance requires the difficult realization that our children do not belong to us. They are simply entrusted to our care until their wings are strong enough to catch the wind. If you try to clip those wings to keep the nest full, the child will eventually realize they are bleeding. And once they recognize the source of the wound, they will walk away, leaving you with nothing but the feathers. Evelyn's quiet, devastating retaliation teaches us a universal truth. You cannot extort loyalty. When a family operates on manipulation, guilt, and moving goalposts, they do not build a safety net. They build a pressure cooker, and eventually, the pressure finds an exit. Evelyn did not scream. She did not throw plates or engage in bitter, tearful shouting matches. She simply recognized her own worth, documented the malice of her captors, and legally secured her perimeter. She let gravity do its job. We share stories like this on Aura Vengeance because the shadows of these dynamics exist in far too many homes. The characters may change, and the stakes may not always involve federal tax evasion or Ivy League admissions, but the quiet, agonizing realization that your family is using you is a universal pain. If you are navigating the complex terrain of family boundaries, or if you simply find strength in the quiet triumph of walking away from toxic obligations, I encourage you to subscribe to the channel. We explore the psychological architecture of these escapes, offering a roadmap for those who are ready to finally set their own boundaries. As you step away from this story, take a moment to look at the dynamics in your own life. Think about the dining table where you sit, whether as a parent or as a child. Look at the faces gathered around it. Are the people at your table sitting there because they are celebrated, respected, and free to leave? Or are they sitting there because they have been made to feel they owe a debt they can never repay? We spend our lives building homes, hoping they will be a place of refuge. But a home built on hidden agendas and quiet extortion is just a cage with softer lighting. The door is always right there, waiting for the moment you decide to turn the handle. The question is, when you finally look closely at the locks, will you find that you have been the one holding the key all along?